So I'm not really a sports fan, not at all. But if you could hear all my English conversations, you might be surprised by how many sports related idioms I use. And not just because they're common, it's because they're so useful. Think about it for a moment. Sports events are full of dramatic moments, exhilarating accomplishments, and crushing defeats. These moments heighten our experiences and emotions. So, having language that can help us do that, that's what makes idioms so powerful and fun to use. They communicate something that plain language just doesn't. And I'll give you a quick example. When someone says, "You knocked it out of the park," they're not just saying, "Good job." In baseball, when a player hits the ball so hard that it flies over the fence and out of the park, it's exceptional. It's an automatic home run, and everyone in the stadium stands on their feet cheering. So, if your boss says you knocked it out of the park, they're telling you that what you did wasn't just good work, it was exceptional. It was beyond expectations, and everyone wants to celebrate with you. So let's compare this idiom to the statement, "You did a great job." Both are positive, of course, but telling someone you knocked it out of the park heightens that experience and emotion, letting them know, again, that what they did was exceptional. It's more powerful. So today I want to share 11 of my favorite sports related idioms. And truthfully, they're perfect for any conversation, whether you're at home just talking to friends and family, or you're using English at work. But to give some structure to these idioms today, to this lesson, I've organized them around themes that connect to the workplace. In each case, you'll discover not just what the idiom means, but also when and how to use them, along with when not to use them. So let's start right away with the first situation, starting a new project or a meeting. Maybe you've been in a meeting with your manager or at a coffee chat with a client to discuss a project, and you've heard someone say, "We need a game plan before we kick things off." And at that moment, others in the room nod their head like they understand exactly what that means. And perhaps you get the general idea, but you're not totally sure. Is using language like game plan and kicking things off different from just saying, "Let's make a plan and start"? If you've got those kinds of questions, let's break these two idioms down. We'll start with to have a game plan. This means to have a clear strategy or plan before something begins, and it comes from American football. Before we get into the details of what this really means, I want to give you an example. You might hear someone say, "Before we launch the service, we need to have a strong game plan for marketing and sales." Now, having a game plan is more specific than simply saying we need a plan. In American football, teams study their opponents. They work to identify weaknesses and create detailed strategies before the game begins. As a result, when you say game plan in a meeting or conversation, you're signaling that you want a thoughtful, strategic approach, not just a casual idea. In this idiom, it works particularly well in strategy meetings, project planning, and team discussions about new initiatives. But there are also times to avoid it. For example, if you use something like this for really simple decisions, it can sound like you're overthinking things. For example, saying, "Do we have a game plan for lunch?" might sound odd because lunch doesn't really need a serious strategy. Now, actually, wait a minute. I should say that some English speakers actually do say things like, "Do we have a game plan for lunch today?" But when they do it, they're saying it as kind of a joke. They're making fun of the idea that lunch requires some super strategic planning. So, unless you're really comfortable with that kind of humor in English, it's safer to avoid it for those more trivial or simplistic situations. And now let's move on to our second idiom. This one is all about energy, to kick things off. In simple terms, this just means to start or begin something, and it comes from soccer or football, as most people call it. I want to give you again a quick example before we get into the details. So, at the beginning of a meeting, you might hear someone say, "Let's kick things off by having everyone on the team introduce themselves." Now, let's compare that to saying, "Let's start the meeting." Of those two examples, one is very neutral, and the other, the idiom, has this kind of energy or momentum behind it. You can almost picture that first kick sending the ball down the field. Again, there's energy, excitement, and momentum to it. So it's perfect for the start of meetings, presentations, workshops, and even energetic team discussions. But here's when it doesn't work. In somber or serious situations, it's best to avoid this. For example, saying something like, "Let's kick things off with a discussion about layoffs," would sound insensitive because the words don't really match the tone or the reality of that situation. Layoffs are worrisome and scary, they're upsetting. So, using a phrase that has energy and excitement behind it sounds wrong when talking about difficult news. Also, this phrase only works at the beginning of something. Once you've started, you can't go back later and add this idiom in. For example, imagine you're in a meeting. You've already been talking for 20 minutes. You've discussed the agenda and reviewed last week's progress. At that point, you can't suddenly say, "Okay, let's kick things off." It's too late. You've already started. So, this idiom is specifically for the moment that you begin something, not for restarting or moving on to a new topic. Okay, once you've started a project or meeting, the next challenge is working well with others. And sometimes this means navigating disagreements and making sure that everyone has what they need to be successful. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at two idioms that you'll often hear when working with others. The first is about reminding people that you're all working toward a shared goal. And the second is making sure that everyone has fair or equal opportunity. So the first one is to be on the same team. This means to collaborate with someone toward a shared goal. You're working together with active cooperation and you have alignment in your purpose. This particular idiom comes from team sports in general, where everyone on the team is working together to win. So, in a conversation at work, you might hear someone say, "I know we disagree about the design, but remember, we're on the same team here. I'm very much open to your thoughts and your concerns." This idiom reminds people that despite disagreements or differences of opinion, all of you share a common goal. As a result, it shifts focus from the conflict to collaboration. And as you might guess, this idiom works well during disagreements when you need to remind your colleagues or team members of your shared goal, your shared purpose. But there are also times to avoid it. In English speaking culture, especially at work, power dynamics can matter here. While a team leader or boss might use this to remind the team of their shared goals, it doesn't work the other way around. If a junior team member says this to senior colleagues, it can sound presumptuous or patronizing. On top of that, we don't use this idiom when there's genuine conflict of interest. Telling someone that we're on the same team just doesn't work if your interests truly are not aligned. For example, two companies working to negotiate a contract aren't necessarily on the same team. They may have very different interests and goals in mind. And now let's move on to our next one. The second idiom in this category for working with others is to level the playing field. This means to make the situation fair for everyone involved. And you might hear it in an example like this. The new policy levels the playing field by giving all employees access to basic AI training. Now, to level the playing field means removing any unfair advantages so that everyone has equal opportunity to succeed. Imagine if in soccer or football, the field were tilted, forcing one team to play uphill while the other team plays downhill. That would be totally unfair, right? So, leveling the playing field is all about creating those fair conditions for everyone. And as a result, this is a perfect idiom to use in discussions on policies, resources, opportunities, and access. Okay, before we keep going, I want to make a quick comment. I know that 11 idioms can feel like a lot. So, in a moment, I'm going to give you my recommendations of which idioms to start with, which ones to start learning and using first, and why. Also, I know that learning these idioms is just one part of the challenge. The other part is actually using them in real conversations. Doing that takes practice. And if you're looking for a place to practice speaking English regularly, that's exactly what we do inside my Confident Women community. It's a women only space where you practice speaking English through real conversations with women from around the world. Every month, you get a new study guide so you always know exactly what to practice, including vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, and conversation topics. And we focus on the kind of language you actually use in everyday life. Once you have that monthly study guide, you also have opportunities to practice in workshops and casual conversation sessions that are available throughout the month. What we do in the Confident Women community isn't just about watching video lessons and doing drills. It's about using English regularly in a safe, supportive environment where mistakes are normal and speaking starts to feel more natural, easier, and even fun. If you would love to learn more and join, you can get all the details at speakconfidentenglish.com/community. And now let's move on to our next situation for this lesson. It's all about taking action and making decisions. As a project moves forward, you'll need idioms for moments when someone has to make a decision, take responsibility, or stay focused on what matters the most. So here we're going to look at three phrases that help us talk about those situations. And the first one is the ball is in your court. This means it's your turn to take action or make a decision. Here's a quick example. I've sent you all the documents, all the information you need, and now the ball is in your court. This particular idiom comes from tennis, and I want you to think about a tennis game. When a ball is in your court, you must hit it back. It's your turn to act. And this phrase or idiom clearly transfers that responsibility. The speaker has done their part, and now you must do yours. So, with that background in place, let's talk about when to use it. It's great for following up on delayed responses or when you need to clearly transfer responsibility after you've completed your part of a project. But similar to another idiom that we've discussed, we don't typically use this idiom when we're communicating with our superiors. Just like the idiom to be on the same team, this one is sensitive to those power dynamics. If a junior employee were to say this to a team leader or their boss, it can sound a bit passive aggressive or presumptuous, which means being excessively bold and confident and not really respecting the expected codes of conduct. Also, we only use this if we've genuinely done everything required on our side. If you haven't completed your part of a project, for example, this phrase wouldn't work. Now, next up, we have the idiom to step up to the plate. This idiom means to take responsibility for something or accept a challenge, especially when it's needed, like in an emergency situation. It's another idiom that comes from baseball. And in baseball, stepping up to the plate means you're ready to bat. You're taking your turn, facing the challenge. And then in business, when we use this, it means that someone took initiative when it was needed the most, often under difficult circumstances. So you might hear it used like this. When our manager was on long-term medical leave, Jenna stepped up to the plate and led the entire project. It's the perfect idiom to use when praising someone who took initiative in a difficult circumstance, or when describing someone who accepted unexpected responsibility. Now, because we're talking about unexpected responsibilities or challenging circumstances, we don't use this idiom for routine responsibilities. This idiom is all about challenging situations that require courage or initiative, not just the everyday tasks that you're supposed to do. On top of that, we tend not to use this idiom to describe our own actions, even if we did do something exceptional. For example, I wouldn't say, I stepped up to the plate. Doing that can sound rather boastful. But what if you do need to describe your own actions, your own initiative in something like a job interview or performance review? In those circumstances, you can soften the language. Instead of saying, I stepped up to the plate, you would say, when the situation required it, I was able to step up and lead the team. And now, our third phrase for this category is to take one's eyes off the ball. This means to lose focus or stop paying attention to something important. Once again, it comes from baseball. We have so many idioms from baseball in English. And I want to give you an example of how to use this. You might hear someone say, sales dropped because we took our eyes off the ball and we ignored our competitors. Of course, in baseball, if you're not watching the ball carefully, you can't hit it, you can't catch it, and it might hit you. Ultimately, it means there was failure. And this idiom warns that losing focus on what's important could lead to failure. As a result, it works really well when you're working with your team to analyze past mistakes or talk about what went wrong. It can also be used as a warning, warning your team of potential distractions. For example, let's not take our eyes off the ball. Our priority is still the product launch. Now, here's just one situation when we want to be careful with this idiom. We want to avoid direct accusations. In giving feedback to someone else, saying something like, you took your eyes off the ball, sounds harsh and accusatory. A much better approach when giving critical feedback is to use a more collaborative word or inclusive word, the word we, even if it was someone else's mistake. So instead, you might say, we took our eyes off the ball in this situation. Now, not only do we sometimes have to deal with disagreements or reminding people of where to keep their focus, sometimes we also need to negotiate. And negotiations can get tough, which means we need language to describe what's happening when someone becomes aggressive or changes the rules unfairly. And there are two great idioms that help us talk about these difficult situations. The first one is to play hardball. This means to use tough or aggressive tactics in negotiations, often being uncompromising or forceful to get what you want. For example, someone might say, the supplier is playing hardball with pricing, so we might need to find someone else. Hardball is literally baseball, as opposed to softball, which is played with a softer, larger ball. And when we use this idiom, we mean that someone is being tough and uncompromising. So when can you use this idiom? This one is perfect for describing how others negotiate, if they have a negotiation style that is very tough or forceful. You might also use it to warn team members about aggressive negotiators. For example, be prepared. They're known for playing hardball. But here's when to avoid this idiom. We don't want to use it in situations requiring diplomacy. Because this idiom focuses on aggression and difficult tactics, it can escalate tension when, in the diplomatic situation, the goal is to de escalate. Now, something else that increases tension is our next idiom, to move the goalposts. This one means to change the rules or the requirements unfairly, and usually after something has already started or been agreed upon. For example, someone might say, I finally met all the requirements for the promotion that I've been working toward for more than a year. But in our meeting today, my manager moved the goalposts and said, I need another year of leadership experience. That situation would be super frustrating, right? And of course, in sports, the goalposts where you score are fixed. They don't move. And if someone did move them during the game, that would be pretty unfair. So this idiom is all about expressing the frustration that we feel when we've agreed to one set of rules and then someone changes them unexpectedly or unfairly. But when does it not work? Well, not all requirement changes are about moving the goalposts. Sometimes an adjustment is reasonable or necessary due to external changes that are totally out of your control, like weather events or economic challenges. And because this idiom shows that frustration and it suggests an unfair approach, we don't use it for changes that are legitimate or necessary. All right, we've reached our final category. Well, we're going to focus on phrases for those intense final moments of a project when you're racing against a deadline or celebrating exceptional results. And the first one here is to be down to the wire. This means to continue until the very last moment before a deadline, or when the outcome is uncertain until that final moment. And this one, it comes from horse racing. The wire is the finish line. And when horses are down to the wire, the race is so close that you don't know who will win until that very last second. So here's an example of how we might use it. You might say, we were down to the wire, but we finished the report just before the deadline. Compare that idiom to saying, we barely made the deadline. Of those two phrases, one simply states a fact, while the other recreates that tension at the end of a race. You can almost feel that sprint to the finish line. And as a result, this idiom works perfectly for situations that have tight deadlines or when you're sharing experiences of high pressure situations. You might also use it to explain why something felt so stressful. For example, we were down to the wire because the client changed requirements at the very last minute. Now, are there any circumstances when you shouldn't use this idiom? Not really. But of course, if you finish something with time to spare, you've got extra time because you finished days or weeks in advance, of course, this idiom doesn't work. Also, this idiom is definitely all about that urgency, that sprint to the finish. But it's also about success. You did make it in the end. So it's not appropriate to use this idiom if a deadline is missed. And finally, our last idiom is to knock it out of the park. As I'm sure you remember, this is the idiom we talked about at the very beginning today. And as a quick reminder, it means to do something exceptionally well. It's all about that moment when someone hits the ball over the fence and everyone stands and cheers. It's a rare but incredible moment. And that's why we use this idiom to compliment or praise others' exceptional work. For example, in a team meeting, you might say to someone, Maria, you knocked it out of the park with your presentation. The board members loved it. That compliment doesn't only suggest that Maria did a fantastic job, but it also suggests that her work is benefiting everyone. The whole team wins. Now, when it comes to this idiom, we usually don't use it to describe our own work, and we don't use it for things that are routine tasks. Instead, it's best to reserve this as a compliment for those exceptional moments. Now, if someone compliments you with this particular idiom, the best way to respond is simply with, thank you. I'm really glad it went well. Or, thank you. The team worked hard on this together. Okay, now that you have these 11 idioms, let's talk about how to start using them in real conversations and which ones to start with if all these idioms are new to you. Here's what I don't want you to do. I don't want you to try to memorize them all today and start using them tomorrow. That approach never really works. Instead, it more often leads to feeling stuck in the moment when you're trying to remember an idiom that you learned in this video but can't find it in the moment. Instead, here's what works. Choose 3 idioms to focus on first. Just 3. When you're selective, it leads to better memory so that you can use these idioms in the moment, in the conversation when you need them, and It reduces the potential for confusion or mixing them up. Now, if you're not sure which three to choose first, I'll give you my recommendations in a moment, but I want to give you an alternative suggestion. You could also choose three idioms that you particularly liked from this lesson, or idioms that you immediately recognized today because they're often used in your workplace. If you recognized some idioms, start with those first. And then once you've chosen your three idioms, I want to give you a way to not just learn them, but actually be able to use them in your English conversations. And I have a three-step approach. The first step is simply listen for these phrasal verbs. Over the next week or 2 weeks, pay attention to conversations and podcasts. Listen for these idioms every time you hear someone else in English. Notice who uses it, when did they use it, and how did others respond. Taking the time to actively listen and observe, it teaches you the natural context of the idiom. For example, if you choose down to the wire, you might start noticing it in conversations and emails. And you might notice that people use it when they just barely made the deadline, or when they're explaining why something was so stressful. This observation builds your understanding of when it fits naturally into conversations. And then step two is to begin practicing it, using it in conversations, but particularly in low stakes situations first. What that means is don't try to use a new idiom in an important high pressure situation right away, like a presentation to your CEO or a meeting with a difficult client. Instead, start in comfortable, low pressure situations where making a mistake doesn't matter as much. And the reason this is important is if you use the idiom awkwardly in a casual email to a colleague, it's really no big deal. But if you use it incorrectly in front of your boss or a client, you risk damaging credibility in an important moment. Practicing in comfortable situations first builds up your confidence. And once you've used the idiom successfully multiple times, that's when you can start to use it anytime you want. And that leads me to step number three. Use each idiom multiple times before moving on to new idioms on the list. Aim to use each idiom 5 or 10 times over a period of 2 or 3 weeks. Doing this develops automatic, natural usage of the idiom. And you'll know when you're ready to add new idioms to your vocabulary when you start using the first three without really thinking about them. They just feel natural. You just use them. They're not memorized or scripted. This three-step approach works because it prevents overwhelm. 3 idioms is manageable, but 11 can feel impossible or overwhelming. It also builds confidence through repetition. And finally, it develops cultural judgment. As you observe how others use these idioms and practice them yourself, you learn when they work and when they don't. That kind of judgment is essential for more complex idioms and complicated conversations. Now, as I said, if you're not sure which idioms to start with, here are my recommendations and why. First, I would recommend down to the wire. This is an easy one to recognize when to use. Again, it's perfect for any tight deadline. And unlike some of the other idioms we've discussed, it doesn't require reading complex social dynamics. You either had a tight deadline or you didn't. That's it. The second one I would recommend is to knock it out of the park. You'll hear this one again and again as a form of praise. And it's wonderful to use to compliment others in the workplace, or even to compliment your son or daughter, your nephew, your niece, your grandchild when they've done something exceptional. It's a safe, positive idiom to use. And then third, I would recommend to kick things off. Again, this one works anytime you're starting something, whether it's a meeting, a presentation, a project, or an event. It's energetic, straightforward, and easy to use. And the context is always clear. You're beginning something. So these 3 idioms are easy to recognize when to use. They work in most professional and also casual conversations, and they help you participate naturally in conversations around you. Then, when you're comfortable with those first three idioms, add three more. Before we finish up today, very briefly, I would love to hear from you. I want to know which three idioms you're going to start with. Try sharing one of them with me in the comments below. You could even include your own example sentence. As always, if you found this particular lesson helpful to you, don't forget to subscribe or follow wherever you're listening or watching from today. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you next time.